Good afternoon and welcome. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Trace Haythorne, Executive Director at ACPE. It is a delight to be with you all in these strange and difficult and incredibly interesting times. We are gathered today for a webinar on making the case for ACPE CPE, strategies for financially challenging times. In a minute, I'll hand it off to Linda Wilkerson, the ACPE Secretary and Treasurer and recently retired Certified Educator. Couple of logistics just to let you know. During the course of this meeting, we will invite you to put questions into the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring those and passing those on to Linda. Each of the presenters will have a minute to present their material and we'll address the Q&A towards the end of the webinar. I wanted to give you a couple of overview remarks as to why this and why now. It started when Dennis reached out to the board's executive committee saying, how do we make sure, particularly we're taking care of programs with a special eye towards CEC as well, and making sure that we keep those positions intact. We have heard a good deal about programs where there have been furloughs or layoffs, temporary downsizings, reductions in force. Each of these different pieces means something slightly different, but we're hearing them from all over the country too. Some of them are particularly in places where there have been hotspots, but some of them are in places where folks are simply not going to the hospital anymore because they don't want to risk possibly being infected. We anticipate as an association, and some of this comes from the survey that many of you participated in earlier this summer around summer units, we expect to see somewhere between 40 to 45% of our regular summer units running, though many of those programs are going to be almost twice their size because they're picking up additional students, often through online capacities. We also expect that this is going to put incredible strains on some of our smaller programs. And it won't just be on the programs, but it'll be on those institutions. Some of the larger systems that are around the country will see this as an acquisitional opportunity. How's that for a nice euphemism from the business world? But an opportunity to pick up one or two more buildings that will become a part of their hospital system. For the most part, that doesn't make me nervous related to our programs. Lots of places have gone through those mergers and acquisitions, and maybe one of our panelists could speak to some recent experience in that. At the same time, we don't want to take that lightly and don't want to be glib about it. Especially if you've been running a program where you've only been able to see 3 or 4 students a unit for a while now, we hope that this becomes a helpful place to equip you for advocacy within your institution, to really be thinking more strategically about what next steps will be. And the other thing that we hear pretty consistently is that our members don't engage actively with administration around budget items. In fact, it would be nice if they could just avoid having those conversations. And it's time to bring those front and center. So we want to begin to equip people for this. Those of you that know the new CEC process know that we've got competencies that are related to financial and administrative management that feels very important for the future, not only of programs in the local scene, but for the association as well. Our hope is that by the end of this, we will have as many questions as we have answers, and we will continue to try to generate resources for you. But with no further ado, let me hand it over to Linda Wilkerson, and she can introduce our panelists and talk a little bit about the format today. Linda?
Okay, thank you, Trace. Well, it's good to be with all of you. I appreciate everybody's attendance at this webinar. First thing I want to do is introduce our panelist, Dennis Kinney. I bet lots of you know Dennis. He got his MDiv from ELTS and studied at Andover Newton, has both a Master's of Sacred Theology and a DMin degree. He was certified in 1972, and he's worked in hospitals in Michigan, California, and also at the Cleveland Clinic. And he was a regional director for ACPE for over 10 years, covering 5 states. In California, he was the founding director for the Institute of Health and Healing that became the largest integrative medicine program in the country. And at the Cleveland Clinic, he started Code Lavender, which is a team response for patients and staff in crisis. I think lots of places around the country are using Code Lavender now. He has training both in psychology and organizational development, and has written a couple of books and has one more, Spiritual Care Assessment, Response, and Referral, that's in process. And in May of 2019, he was our Distinguished Service, received our Distinguished Service Award. So we're grateful that you're here, Dennis. Amani Legeneur, did I say that correctly, Amani? Is our second panelist. She has been the manager of spiritual health and education at Northside Hospital System for more than a decade. She's an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and an ACPE Certified Educator. She trained at Emory and also has substantial experience in leadership development outside of CPE. She views financial wellness as a cornerstone for creating robust spiritual care program for her organization. She will tell you herself that she doesn't think she's an expert, but she does have a lot to share with us, and she's grateful for this opportunity to be with you all. And then Mark Grace as the Vice President and Chief of Mission and the Office of Mission and Ministry for the Baylor Scott and White healthcare system. That's one of the largest healthcare systems in the U.S. He's been with Baylor and then Baylor Scott and White for over 26 years, the last 10 years in this current position. He was certified as an ACPE educator in 1992 as an ordained Baptist minister. He oversees about 180 employees. 150 of those are chaplains within the Baylor Scott and White system. His efforts over the last 26 years include promoting spiritual care in every sphere of the system, championing efforts to implement and to study the impact of employee purpose, sense of calling, commitment to altruism and volunteerism on overall employee well-being and engagement. And he's also been persistent in creating spiritual care and pastoral care education programs that highlight the crucial need for diversity and inclusion, as well as work in underserved communities as key dimensions of what that Office of Mission and Ministry does. He's also delighted to be a panelist today and to share his experience with you all. What we're going to do as a way of entering into this topic, which is a pretty broad one, we're going to have basically 4 topics that the panelists are going to address, and for about 10 minutes each, and then at the end of the time we'll take your questions. The first topic is responding to the call for cost cutting, then strategies for positioning CPE and spiritual care. We're going to talk a little bit about where to look for monies outside of the operating budget, and then education for administration and finance. And so we're going to begin with responding to the call for cost cutting. Dennis is going to lead off, and then Amani and Mark are going to chime in. So Dennis, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, or I guess afternoon in some places. It's good to be here, and welcome to folks. As Trace was making a couple comments, it reminded me of how some of this became important to me several years ago. There was a point in my career when I had worked really hard to stay away from budgets and organization and administration, and it suddenly dawned on me, especially as I was given 2 more departments that had no budget attached to them, that I better learn about administration and fundraising and budget creation. And what happened to me is that it became a ministry for me. Administration did, and supporting the spiritual care department and eventually other departments was essential. And if that was going to happen, then I need to be good at it, and I need to be trained for it. That was a surprise in my career, that at one point then my ministry and my call to ministry happened to be to administration. So background to most of my comments about responding to the call for cost cutting has to do with the theory that you see the slide up now on. And a lot of this comes from my book, Promise of the Soul. So if you want to know more about it, that's a place to go. In that book was centered around individuals who have spiritual covenants, covenants with God, spiritual agreements, from which most of our relationships are built and from which we make most of our decisions. Part of the surprise for me was that organizations have the same. Most often they have, and now they certainly are not all places are going to talk about them as if they're spiritual agreements, but they have that flavor, even if they're very specifically trying not to be spiritual or religious. They have the flavor because they're committed to these kinds of agreements where they make most of their decisions. The problem comes is that they often are not identified. And they don't always match the marketing of that particular healthcare system or organization, and they don't match the mission and values that are often talked about. An example, just to give you one quick example, is when I walked into the Cleveland Clinic, there was one employee left in the spiritual care department, and that was the administrative assistant who'd been there for about 26, 27 years. I knew very little about the system. It took me about a week to find out that the PR things that had been broadly talked about in terms of caring for patients, every life deserves world-class care, and a lot of what became the patient experience movement in this country came out of the clinic, and it was talked about all the time. I learned very quickly that that's not where the decisions were made. The decision was made, and there was no apologies for it. The decisions were made because at the time I arrived, I think they were number 3 in the country to Mayo and Johns Hopkins. And the primary agreement that you had to understand about the clinic was that they wanted to be number 1. And if you didn't recognize that, or you didn't help them get to that point, you didn't last very long. I remember a young physician was brought up to lead a very significant program. It paid him a lot of money. He moved up to Cleveland, I think out of Texas, and within a year he was gone. His scores didn't come up, and he was brought in to raise that particular department's success ratio. So, as I said, if you're looking at the theory sheet, our problem as we try to lead spiritual care departments is that our personal covenants with God, our spiritual agreements or spiritual values that we're committed to, don't always match those spiritual agreements that the organizations we work in have. Sometimes it's hard to get a hold of them, and it's a mystery when they start making program decisions that don't seem to match the mission and values of the organization. And that's when we often get upset and frustrated and angry because we're not understanding what's happening, or we don't think they're holding to the ethic or value that they're espousing. So one of the key rules, Trace, on some of the key rules slide, maybe I can just show those quickly, is, and here's how you prepare yourself, I think, to get ready to deal with cost cutting. You want to find out what your bosses or the administration's or the hospital overall spiritual commitment is, so that when you know that, you can then write to those when you're trying to make the case for holding your budget, increasing your budget, or limiting your cost cutting. And as I say in rule number 1 there, when you mess with organizations' spiritual agreements, these values that they hold rigidly, and each spiritual agreement has a spiritual breaker to it. Things that you're not supposed to do. Now, the problem is often you're not often told what that is, but you need to find out what they are. And as I said, the more they're held on to rigidly, if you mess with them, then there's hell to pay. So know what your bosses or the organization's covenants are, and don't break them. And write and position yourself and write your materials to those covenants, so that when we were, and Amy Green came to the clinic, when we were writing a proposal for something, I always tried to make sure that we were writing to the sense of being number one in the country. I remember a meeting with our boss, both Amy and I went, and we were very proud to tell him that we wanted to have the best supervisory training program in our region, in the Midwest. That was our goal. And we had thought that through. We had presenting some material to him, and we were very happy to present it. And then there was this silence that lasted about 25 seconds. And I thought, oh, here it comes. He's going to tell us why he can't afford it, why he can't do it, etc. And this has never been said to me before working in hospitals. He looked at us and he said, why do you only want to be number one in the Midwest? Why aren't you developing it across the country? Why aren't you trying to be number one? That was a primary thing that we missed when we were trying to write to that covenant.
Hey, Dennis, could I speak to a couple of those? Because
yeah.
First of all, many thanks to Dennis. I'm going to read your book. I feel ignorant that I haven't looked up and read it.
I get 7 cents a copy, Mark, so please.
Okay. I love what you've said, and we made a fundamental shift in the late, maybe 99, maybe as late as 2001, where we developed a strategy of doing exactly what Dennis said. And it came from a board member that we invited to come talk with us. And these were his words. I'm quoting him, very religious man, but he said, nobody knows your damn story. You got to tell your story. And after I got over being embarrassed about that, we began to ask that question, and Dennis's answer is really what we came up with. And then from there, we did the old-fashioned SWOT analysis. We started doing blessings for administrators. We hadn't done that before. And I started putting administrators on my spiritual care rounds that I would not have done before. I discovered some just had to say goodbye to our chief compliance officer, who was part of our cuts, a very devout person. I hate to say that my stereotype of a chief compliance officer was blown all to bits by him. And that issue is really crucial. And if you don't have a plan, then I think you become the victim of what Dennis just talked about. And the danger is you're going to speak up and you're not going to be speaking to what's really driving decisions.
I'm going to interrupt right now because we're kind of at our 10-minute time unit for this particular section. Amani, is there anything that you wanted to add on this responding to cost-cutting calls?
No, I'd rather cede my time back to Dennis to see if there's anything he wanted to add to finish up.
Okay. And Dennis, tell us about your book and where people can get it.
Promise of the Soul, you can get it on Amazon or Kindle, both. It's available. Okay.
Last words you want to say in particular about responding to the call for cost cutting?
Find out what those organization values are and and it's going to be difficult sometimes because the organizations don't talk about them. In California, it was very clear. Every time I walked into the COO's office, he started our conversations with, "Now, Dennis, you're a part of the team, aren't you? You're part of the team, right?" That was before we even started. And his whole point was, being part of the team means I was going to support whatever he decided. Now, I had to figure out if I was going to challenge him or bring new ideas to him, I'd better do it in the context of being part of his team.
Great.
You know, so.
Well, thanks. We're going to move on, and I'm sure you'll be able to bring in some of your other things, but we're going to talk a little bit about strategies for positioning CPE and spiritual care. Mark, I'm going to ask you to lead off on this particular question. I know that you at Baylor Scott and White have done a return on investment study that maybe you'll talk a little bit about.
Yeah, and pardon me, Dennis, I thought we were chiming in there on the last one.
Oh, no, that's
No, you
fine.
were.
Please feel free.
That's right, you were.
Didn't mean to interrupt.
Nope.
So Dennis has given us this incredible foundation, and repeat what I'm talking about one more time just so that I get it fixed in my brain.
Strategies for positioning CPE and spiritual care.
Yeah, so research would be a foundation of that. And I'll post in the chat two things. One is the link to our ROI study, which I am almost sure, I couldn't find it this morning, but I'm almost positive an updated study has been done by Transforming Chaplaincy. So I'm going to post the Transforming Chaplaincy website. George Fitchett and his colleagues there are doing incredible work. We all ought to be reading that on almost a daily basis. They're doing really important work that'll help us. Lots of great resources. The other things that I alluded to just now have to do with having a real pastoral care strategy across the system. And you know, when people ask me to boil down, quote unquote, the secret to my success, I started out with this organization as a student, staff chaplain, left and came back as director, VP, and then VP, Chief Mission and Ministry Officer. I say, I've just tried to duplicate the basic training that I had in what to do on a nursing unit. First week, I took a little notebook with me. I learned every nurse's name. Second week, I started asking them about their families. Third week, I went back and talked to them about their families and what their families were doing. And that essentially has been the strategy. I think Dennis is right in terms of mentoring, not just CPE students, but mentoring staff chaplains, chaplain managers, directors of spiritual care. That really has been the thing I've focused on is you have to be part of the organization and rise above your level. I'm a VP. Now, when I first got the title Chief Mission and Ministry Officer, I thought I really was chief. And then I found out there are chiefs and there are chiefs. There are VPs, there are senior VPs, there are EVPs, there's the president, and there's the CEO. But I walked around there, you know, like the cock of the walk for a long time until somebody, because they didn't give me a great orientation to executive processes, somebody pulled me aside and very gently said, hey, you know, you're just a VP. But to me, it's really been crucial on two perspectives. One is not to assume that somebody won't talk to me, and to start the conversation before the crucial conversation. so that I know something about those individuals and to be committed to their spiritual care. And I've had a lot of, as I mentioned before, a lot of my own stereotypes, small town, small church, Baptist preacher's kid, a lot of my stereotypes about people have been busted up. The other thing is, I would agree with Dennis, if you're not plugged into the organization's unspoken commitments, and if you don't understand those, then you're going to run up on the rocks. That takes some time. That's a slower process. Interestingly enough, taking our spiritual care, taking our calling to heart, it's just like narrative medicine. You get lots more information going in and visiting with somebody about who they are, and you hear things you would never hear before, even if they're confused. Plenty of people have welcomed me somewhat suspiciously, certainly quizzically, wondering what I'm doing in their office, and I have a spiel. I bring around the annual report. You know, I open it up and point to the places where what we do intersects with what they do. That's a real task. But the other part of that is something Eugene Peterson said that I read in 1990 that set me on fire and became my model, and that was, he said that the pastor's job is to undermine the kingdom of self and to usher in the kingdom of God. And he speaks about that in The Contemplative Pastor. He said, we're subversives. So I've really been driven by that idea of subversion, of always finding alliances and relationships. One of them that has turned out to be really crucial has been my relationship with our Chief Diversity Officer, both crucial in terms of holding me accountable, but crucial also in terms of not just being another white guy who cries, you know, at the plight of people of color, but of being willing for Jawan to be my mentor and instructor, our Chief Diversity Officer. Then the other piece, I see you getting ready to cut me off, so hang on.
Yeah.
Then, so finding partnerships and alliances that undermine some of the more unhealthy aspects of the unspoken culture, and that begin to lift it up, especially with regards to CPE. So I'll stop there.
I just wanted to give Amani or Dennis both a chance to chime in just a little bit on strategies for positioning CPE and spiritual care. Just have a minute or two before we need to move on, but.
I'll actually be talking about that in depth at the beginning of my presentation, so I'll.
Okay, you'll wait. All right.
I just want to underline the importance Mark has talked about building relationships with people in the upper administration. The guy I told you about Team was a former Marine and was the COO of the hospital. If I could say almost anything to him, but that was because we had a relationship. If I had walked in and started critiquing, and he went nuts when somebody came in and critiqued and didn't have 3 solutions that went with the critique. So building relationships, understanding yourself as part of the administration and organization is vital.
I wanted to ask whether you all have had experience working with aligning your department or area's goals with the strategic plan of the organization.
Well, Linda, you could talk about that better than the rest of us. I think faith community, faith health was one of Parkland's key strategies back when you were director there. Sacred vocation is very much, and that's the calling part, helping employees to understand their own calling. that's been tied to the organization. So we got resources from corporate communication. Our chief HR officer met with, we got to practice with that person, our presentation, got lots of great feedback. So that's one example. Another example is our chief operating officer. A number of years ago, we sold that person on the concept of outcome-oriented chaplaincy, the need to prioritize spiritual distress in our care, and that person has saved jobs for us, literally reached out and saved jobs for us. So those are some examples.
Yeah.
I did it every year, Linda. Took the strategic plan for the hospital for that year and matched up our department goals and our budget
Right.
with it. But I would say again, hospitals, no matter how much they ask you to do ROIs, to write strategic plans, they will make their decisions on the basis of two things. One, the relationship they have with you in spiritual care. And secondly, on the actual spiritual, behind the scenes spiritual value that they're operating on, which they're not going to tell you always. So.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, we're going to move on, and I'm going to let Amani's going to present to us on two things. One is looking for monies outside of the operating budget, which is always important, and then also education for administration and finance. So Amani, we're going to turn it over to you, and if we have a little time left, we'll invite Dennis and Mark to chime in, and then we will take questions from you all.
Thank you, Linda. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. And thank you to all of you for being here as both panelists and participants. I've said to my colleague panelists that I feel a little bit out of my depth in this presentation because I don't see myself as a masterful budgeter. My family will tell you that readily. I think I do a better job at work than I do at home, however, and I'm happy to share about what I think has been most helpful. Where I can echo and join Dennis and Mark is that I have a relational approach to budgeting and have done a lot of work in forming alliances with my leadership. They have not asked me to do an ROI. They haven't asked me to align my strategic goals with theirs because our organization doesn't do explicit strategic planning. What they do is assume that you know what they're thinking, which means that you have to do a lot of work. I have to do a lot of work to understand how to communicate back to them who we are and how we serve. So budgeting outside of the box. One of the things that has been extremely helpful to me is categorizing my students to best advantage within my operating budget, utilizing alternative funding sources within my organization, and nurturing alliances, as I said before, with influencers who value spiritual health inside of my organization. So choosing the best budget bucket for your CPE program is key. For me, that means understanding the difference between an FTE, a supplemental staff person or contract employee, and an unpaid or paid student. In our system, our students are categorized as supplemental staff or contract employees. We partner with Chris 180, which is a local nonprofit who is holding the accreditation for our program and are a satellite of that program. The advantage of that is that our students don't show up in our productivity scores. They don't show up as additional employees in our department. And I've been able to gradually add students over the years because they're generally off the radar of the organization. In terms of alternative funding sources, having relationships really does hit your bottom line in certain ways, being kind to people. So we noticed that our IT folks generally don't have a lot of conversations with people as they go and do their work in various departments around the hospital. So we struck up conversations with them, as we naturally do as chaplains, and started to learn about their lives. And soon enough, we started to get free computers. And I'm not saying that this happens every time, but they would think of us and they'd notice things about our technology. And when the hospital itself was updating its technology without having to add to our capital budget request, they brought us new equipment, and they do that every couple of years, which is fantastic. When we moved to telechaplaincy in response to the COVID crisis for our students, our organization provided us with iPhones for every student. And again, that was because of the high esteem within which they hold our department and the relationships that we had with the folks on the ground. So don't be afraid to talk with folks who are in other departments about their resources. Sharing resources can go as far as sharing a GoToWebinar account with learning and organizational development, so you don't have a $400 bill every month for that. So just thinking outside of the box there has been very helpful for me. Working with the hospital foundation to identify CPE as something that contributes to community benefit hours has also helped to speak back to my organization about value added in numbers that they understand. You know, we sometimes will joke about how many lawsuits we save them every year, but they don't actually count what that costs in dollars and cents. They can count what community benefit hours we can contribute to the organization. Looking for grant monies, research money is also a good way to look for alternative funding sources within your organization. We have a fantastic relationship with our auxiliary and volunteer services. Every year we apply for money for things like inspiration rocks, care notes. They funded a guitar, a candle stand, stained glass windows, anything we think will help with patient care. They're more than happy to support us with. So every year that adds another $5,000 to $10,000 to my operating budget. But we have to ask for it to get it. After we did that for so many years, I remember one year I missed the deadline and the treasurer of the auxiliary called me and he said, "Don't you want $5,000? I said, "Yes, please." But that was because we built a relationship with each other, and he knew that our department benefits from their funding, and that immediately impacts our ability to do patient care. Community partnerships are also very important. Donations from churches, donations from other funding sources outside that share in the mission and values of your spiritual health department can help to add a little bit of financial resource in places where you might be otherwise lacking. We talked a lot about this, so I won't pause on this very long. But one thing I'll say is that I, present like an extrovert or an ambivert, but I think I lean towards introversion. So it was hard for me when I first became a manager 10 years ago to approach leaders to try to help them to understand what spiritual health is. However, over time, actually caring for them as a care responder, what naturally flows out of my being and out of my training has helped them to really get what it means to have a chaplain, because I've been a chaplain to many of the people in my administration. There is a sort of isomorphic resonance that happens between being their chaplain and them understanding what it means to train other chaplains to be that way too. And having nurses in particular, but also patients, speak back to the organization about how beneficial their contacts with us have been, has been our probably biggest selling point to staying fiscally healthy. So, budgeting strategically. I add a minimum of 2 to 3% more money in every appropriate budget bucket every fiscal year to account for inflation, because accounting understands that. I also build in budget requests that may not be essential. So maybe an extra chair or two or a desk that I want. I genuinely want them, but I don't need them. So if something falls short in another place, I can call my friends in accounting and say, is it okay if I move this allocated funding to another budget bucket where it's more needed at this time. Developing a growth mindset, if I can leave you with anything, is probably the greatest lesson that I've learned through time. I don't like asking anybody for money in general. You know, I've been taught to be very self-sufficient in my life. However, valuing your department is different than asking for money. It's saying, you know what, I believe in what we're doing. I believe that we need resources to do it. We are valuable. We've spent a lot of time and energy in our training. And what we do is purposeful at the bedside. So that growth mindset is saying to your organization, we want more spiritual help. The more chaplains you give us, the more residents you give us, the more proactive we're able to be. Then we're not just putting out fires, we're actually helping people to prevent spiritual distress at the bedside. Spend all of your money, because they, in my organization at least, don't give you more unless you spend what you've got. Demonstrate need. So that little bit more you need to work out with your leadership. But spending all of your budget and a little bit more says, we need a little bit more next year.
If I could just add to the, is it okay if I?
Oh yeah,
Sure.
absolutely.
I'll try to be concise, but so there was an economic downturn in which it was announced to me that I had to now raise money, produce philanthropy, and my immediate response was, that's not what I hired on to do. But it was also immediately apparent that if we didn't start raising money, we were gonna have to forgo key services. And so we've raised about $5 million over the 25 years I've been here. That sounds like a lot, but this is an organization where they can raise $200 million in a single year. And the real key to that is to begin to assemble lists of people that you can talk to. We did something in our department where we just took 6 months. We asked our chaplains to do spot studies. How many grateful patients have you run into this week? Then the next 2 weeks, of your grateful patients, how many of those have expressed a desire to give something back, anything? And we talked about the theology of what we're doing, because for our people, what I've always understood is that spiritual caregivers need to be satisfied with the ethics, not just the optics. And they need to have an understanding within themselves, so that during COVID, we had a donor come forward just literally out of the woodworks who saved our summer CPE programs, because we're paying a stipend for that. We won't be in the future, but we already had letters out. We were going to have to tell students they couldn't come, and this person donated $50,000 that allowed us to continue to do CPE internships. So that's it. Thanks, Amani.
Yeah. Now that we know Amani's an expert, there are the 7 last words for a spiritual care department. Leave me alone to do my job. You just, which misses that your job is to relate to administration, as Amani spelled out and Mark has, to be creative with your budgets. We hardly ever talk about diversifying our budgets, but that's what Amani just presented. I think it's important to think big. When I was given 5 departments, none of which had budget, I was told that I had to raise $600,000 to $800,000 a year. After I got up off the floor, I also started reporting to the foundation arm of the hospital, which is a key. If you don't know much about your foundation, as I already know by sending ideas and ask for money to ACPE, if you're not on the priority list, you're not going to get the money. You're going to be seen as a competitor to what the priorities are. Know your foundation, talk to them, get on the priority list. We raised $15 million in 10 years.
Wow.
For the overall department. And to think big enough, and that's my only point in saying that, to think big enough and believe there are people there, as Mark just said, that are waiting and very interested. They're tired of giving to buildings for hospitals. They want to give to people. But you've got to be on the approved fundraising list to even begin that process. So think big, diversify, and collaborate, as Amani was saying. So.
Well, that goes right along with Amani's slide there. Think like there is no box. I love that.
Yep. Yep.
I'm going to transition us to questions from folks. And we received a couple from folks before this. I'm going to start with those. One person asks, are you familiar with any movement around reimbursement for staff chaplains from insurance and CMS, like other fields like social work, and have been able to get?
Well, yeah, palliative. I was just going to say, palliative care is has made monies available for chaplains. That's one place.
Yeah.
Mark?
The news on this end is not so good. Maybe I should start with the good news, and that is that we've been able to plug into a number of grants. So just to follow what Amani and Dennis have both said, is to equip people in your organization who can research and look for other opportunities. So there are grants and so forth. Our most recent effort was to work with freestanding surgical facilities to see if there were a possibility for us to get paid for doing advanced directive assessments with their people. The organization itself, our freestanding surgical facilities, were really enthusiastic about it. Ultimately, we couldn't make it by compliance. My good friend over in compliance. But I think it was it was worthwhile effort. Frustrating, yes, but worthwhile in the sense of we found out a lot of stuff that might work and that will serve us in the future.
So I'm just gonna.
Yeah, ministers never think that they know anybody with money, and they don't even like talking about money. Many of us. So brainstorming with your own staff of who they know might have money for you will be a very interesting exercise for you, I think.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other questions was came from somebody who's on the call right now. It says that their organization is requiring a 2 to 3% cut every year in the budget. So this sounds like a system that's struggling. And how do you nurture a growth mindset in that environment where you're also every year being asked to cut your budget little by little?
Well, I'm sure the questioner already knows there's a crisis every year, right? So you're always, I mean, one year it's nurses' salaries have gone through the roof, so we all have to take cuts to support that. Coronavirus, all kinds of other pandemics. I think most of what, particularly Amani was talking about, you need to begin to build that base. Our problem, as everybody knows, is most of our budget are people. We don't have a lot of surplus to hide budget cuts. But if you're asking in each year more than what you actually need to function, you've built yourself some surplus and some base. it's a matter, again, of trying to speak to what the values of your organization are. Because even though they're asking for cost cutting, if you speak to their values from which they make decisions, you're going to do a whole lot better than those who don't.
I'm going to chime in here, even though I'm not a panelist, and say one of the things I always felt like was important, because I've had that same experience over and over again, was to detail out what it meant in terms of loss of services if we had to cut a budget by 2% or 3%. Because I think if you're just talking about numbers, people that's just cut and dried. But to be able to say, hey, you know, if we do this, then your nurses are not going to get X, Y, and Z that we promised to them. Or the patients on this unit, we're not going to be able to provide these services. And that spoke a lot louder than just saying, wow, boy, 2 or 3% is going to be hard for us to come up with.
That's right. I'll echo that, Linda. Monolithic, like across the board budget cut means something different for a department that's padded than departments like ours. So I'm echoing Dennis in that we're talking about people changes, usually personnel changes. One of the advantages that we found in my system that doesn't immediately look like one with the COVID crisis is that the system is actually learning how dependent on chaplaincy it has become because they haven't funded us for enough staff chaplains. They were really depending on our CPE program to carry the weight of 24/7 chaplaincy in most of our facilities. When they caused the students to leave, now they're seeing, oh, there are gaps here. Are we willing to further invest then, is the question, in order to fill those gaps? Well, not immediately from the accounting end. However, when nurses start to complain, administrators start to listen. And now enough nurses are complaining about perceived service gaps that we're circling back around. I just got a text about 30 minutes ago about how we can find areas of the budget that, again, may not be as much on the radar from an accounting perspective as FTEs are, but that can bring more personnel into our department. So I think part of it is just not being demoralized, which is easy for me to say right now because I'm funded well enough, but to understand that it is okay to give voice to what this will mean on the ground to patients and to staff if you have to lose students or staff because of consistent budget cuts to a department that can't afford it.
Yeah, to
Thanks.
that I would add partner. We have a partnership with Community Benefits. Actually, an administrator, a VP, who's become a dear friend of mine, but started out as an administrative resident, that I really went out of my way. She had some interesting spiritual questions, comes from a Hindu background, is trying to figure out this Baptist system. But we entered into a partnership that we called somewhat boringly, it's our Community Endeavors Coalition, which combines our faith community health with community health worker, that program. And as a result, one of the administrators gave us, they continued to pay out of their cost center, but they gave this person, called and equipped and really on the ball to help serve us in our faith community health programs. And she wasn't a chaplain, but her impact on CPE students, on the overall spiritual care effort, has been huge because she stepped into our organization with lots of experience that we didn't have, and incredible motivation.
So I'm gonna interrupt you just for a second because I'm looking. We've got 5 minutes left, and there are a few more questions that I want to address. Have you all address. And asks, which economic models do you think are the most effective and the least effective? Over CECs, residencies, interns, contract educators, full-time educators. I don't know if anybody wants to take a crack at that. And quickly, because I've got another question for you as
Yeah,
well.
what was the first part of the question, Linda? I'm sorry.
Which economic models are the most effective and then the least effective when you're talking about CECs, residencies, interns, contract chaplains, full-time educators?
I wanted to point out, people should look up a Gallup survey on disengaged employees. In a workforce of 32,000 people, 10 to 12% of employees, no matter what the workforce is, are disengaged. But in 32,000, that translates out to $200 million. So these kinds of surveys that show disengaged or engaged employees, I recommend people take a look at. There's a way to build, that's one of the reasons we started Code Lavender, is trying to deal with disengaged employees in a more effective way. So that's a point. I don't know, Amani, do you have any thoughts about which strategy helps or not help a particular category? You talked about it in your slides. Depending on where you put your students, and sometimes we put them in different buckets because we're trying to get them benefits, healthcare benefits. So, you know, I don't know if you got thoughts about that,
Yeah.
but.
I think it's a complex question. You know, I'm not an economist, so I'm not sure exactly what you mean by economic models, but method-wise, I do think that finding the bucket for your budget that this is going to best fit in is essential. Our CECs are in the same purchase services budget bucket as the rest of our CPE program. We do add enough money into that bucket that they are able to pay the employer portion of healthcare. So all of our students have health benefits and life insurance as well, and workers' comp. But again, all of that flies under the radar because they're not FTEs inside of our organization. So, you know, any way you can not make a student an FTE, that's been the most probably beneficial strategy.
Right.
Let me add, I'm gonna jump right in because we got one more question.
Okay.
And it's an important one from someone who says, what if I don't control my budget? And then we're gonna
at least get a conversation about it. None of us really control our budget.
Right.
But to be able to talk fluently about what your hopes are for your budget and how not controlling your budget or not even being invited to the table is disempowering. I would say it in the positive. It would be really empowering if you could teach me how you make budget decisions and I can speak back to you about how this is actually benefiting our patients.
Make sure that whoever controls the budget, they get to do what they will, but make sure that you give them the script they need and can use when they're in that meeting that you're not invited to. I can't emphasize that enough. Have a focused message and make sure that those people have that message.
I just consulted with somebody who had that exact problem. They were not the budget determiners. And what he found out after we talked is that his values that he wanted attended to in budget were not the values of the person that was creating the budget. So relate to those folks, build a relationship, find out what the values and the principles are being used to determine budget, and then try to speak to them.
Thanks. I think we're almost at the very end, and I wanted to note that Amani and both Amani and Dennis have some great slides. We didn't get to go through all of them, but this presentation is being recorded and it'll be on the ACPE website under the ACPE resources tab. So you'll have an opportunity to look at it in depth. I'm sure that both Dennis, Mark, and Amani would all be grateful and be happy to talk individually with you if you have further questions. We just barely touched the surface of this topic, but I'm delighted that we did surface it enough to have so many of you come and participate. I'm sure you probably have other questions, or I hope that it's generated ideas for you. Trace, I'm going to turn it back over to you if there are any final thoughts you want to say.
Just to say, if you have ideas or needs that you hope we'll program for, please let us know. Just a highlight from the chat for those who may not have seen it. George Fichette and the folks at Transforming Chaplaincy have developed a certificate in spiritual care management that aligns with the competencies within the CEC program. That's available, and it's an excellent program. It's one of the first that we know of that's out there that we think is really worth your while. So give that a look. We know this is a complicated and ongoing area that we need to pay attention to, so we want to program other opportunities for you. Please send your questions our way, and we will have this posted as early as Monday of next week. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everyone who attended. An hour seems so short in Zoom land, especially with process people, but I'm grateful for Linda's leadership in this, especially in the ways that she can call Mark out. That was delightful. So good to be with all of you. Have a great afternoon, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.
Thank you.